Just to move the program forward, a reminder that we're here because of the good graces of Bioneers and Kenny and the team. This is a what they call in the Brave New World, this is called an intensive. And you are called climate leaders. And we are trying to accomplish in one day a conversation that will focus us more on California's leadership and California's direction and how far we have to go in the next 4 years, which includes the rest of the Brown administration and the climate talks internationally, with every day really counting. So a lot has been jammed into the discussion so far, and I'm sorry to say that jamming will continue to go on. Then later tonight, for those who have survived the first step, we can have an open discussion from 7 to 9, followed in January by a further meeting of organizers who want to implement a plan. Because by January, we'll know how the elections came out. By January, we'll know what happened, if anything, in Lima at the summit. By January, we'll have a new legislature, we'll have the governor's budget. We'll begin to have the tools that we need to make a final decision about where we're going. One of the most helpful resources in this process is Arsenio Mataka, who's from the EPA and who's with us now and drove all the way from the Bay Area. Or we're in the Bay Area. The Bay Area should apply for recognition at the European Union. Then it could attend the summit as its own entity. But those of us from LA are in complete awe of the Bay Area and wonderment. So I met Arsenio and learned of something that was a real prize that needs to be distributed widely everywhere. Somebody asked me a few months ago, do you know what the OIHA tool is? I thought it was some knife thing from prison. I didn't know what this was. And I talked to a very high official of the administration, and they said something that was very revealing, that the state had decided to actually reveal data that it had, and that this was daring to disclose this information. It's information about where people live, what racial background, class background, what the pollution levels are, what the health problems are, what the state looks like if you really map it, and you can see that it's not a single state. There's Berkeley and there's Kern County. There's the Redwoods and there's Orange County. LA sort of in the center. And what was useful about this so-called tool will depend on how much you use it and familiarize yourself with it, because you can suddenly look at your area or look at the state, and this abstraction about reducing emissions and raising equality becomes vividly clear at the devastating portrait of poverty combined with pollution in a single spine in the state of California, and how if you looked at the environmental sentiment and organizations, they would be on the coast, where the problem is least except for the ocean. And whether it's in parks for all, any issue you want to measure, we have the stratification of American society along racial and economic lines is built into the distribution of pollution. And so the organizing has to be from the communities that are the most devastated and long-suffering, with allies in the environmental movement across the state and the country. And this is not just a question of morality or justice. If you're going to deal with the world, obviously, the world is mainly people of color and poor people. If you're going to get through any UN process, you've got to make a deal between the haves and the have-nots. There has to be what used to be called affirmative action. I don't know what it's called now. But essentially, we have a State Department that says the world shouldn't really be coming to the United States asking for money. That would be inappropriate. That's the official line of the United States climate negotiator. With that kind of thinking, we're going backhill rapidly. We have a short time to change that kind of thinking by sending a message based on reality in California, based on achievements in California, and that message has to go to the White House and to the climate talks. So Arsenio is really in the center of this debate and discussion about the nature of the reality, but also the nature of what next steps might be taken and what tools might be available to all of us to help move this process forward in the direction of justice. Senator, thank you so much for coming, and welcome.
That's pretty cool. You know, until maybe a year ago, I hadn't met Tom, and it was an honor to be introduced by him. Well, this is an extraordinary honor to be here with all of you today. I think my mother was more excited for me than I was excited too, but my mom was really excited because, you know, she filters through all the YouTube videos and, you know, catches it when she can on some of the stations that show Bioneers. And she was, Arsenio, you know that they video everything there. And so you got to be careful about what you say. And so, but she was really happy for me to be here. Again, my name is Arsenio Mataka. I am the Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at the California Environmental Protection Agency. And as Tom described, I spend most of my time at the CalEPA thinking about and trying to help what we call disadvantaged communities. That is not my term that I prefer, but that is the term that has taken its course in the legislature as well as the sort of stuff that we deal with. So I use that term, disadvantaged communities. When I speak of disadvantaged communities, I talk about those specific communities that Tom was mentioning. Those areas of the state that have a relatively high pollution burden and a relatively high vulnerability to that pollution. You know, we're no longer just looking at whether you're poor or not. We're looking at the effects of being poor and how that is happening and how that is affecting your ability to deal with the pollution. We're also looking at, of course, sensitive populations. And you know, some of these communities are facing really dire environmental conditions. Communities that, in many cases, are filled with, you know, a sense of hopelessness in some cases. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about the power of a story. I know there's a session that will be happening after this that talks about reframing climate, and I think my talk will center a lot on that today. But I could also, through questions, get into some of the more political sort of issues with respect to the tool that Tom mentioned. But I really want to focus on the power of a story. And now I didn't learn about, you know, the real powers of messaging and stories. You know, I'm a lawyer, and I didn't learn it through CalEPA. I learned it while being a young man back home. And I apologize. This first story is something that I have a lot of friends in the room that they may have heard this, but a lot of you are new faces to me, so I feel like I should share this story with you too. You know, I learned about the importance of the story in the country of California, this spine of California that Tom describes. I grew up in a small farm worker community in the Central Valley, in Stanislaus County. And one of the most vivid memories that I have as a young man, I can't remember a lot about my adolescence growing up. I mean, it's just something that, I mean, maybe I have problems, but I can't seem to remember a lot. But I do have this vivid memory of, you know, just a blistering hot summer day in the late 1980s when I was a kid, and I must have been like around 7 or 8. And some friends of mine were, you know, playing in this dirt patch, playing marbles and munching on some snacks, and all of a sudden, you know, my friends and I stood into the astonishment of you know, these kids. Now, in a small town, there's like 500 people there, right? You don't see a lot of people come into your town. When a lot of people come, there's something happening, you know, a lot of times not good. So there's these trucks and trucks and trucks lining the streets filled with appliances, filled with refrigerators, washing machines, water heaters, all kinds of supplies. And these people are not from our community, and we're wondering, like, what the hell is going on here, right? And, you know, we see these people, you know, walking up to us, and over the course of maybe a few hours, you know, it's as it seemed, at least as a child, you know, we saw what took place. You know, a basic assessment by this crew of men and women coming into our homes, all our homes in our communities, and pulling out, you know, old refrigerators. They replaced our refrigerator. We had an old refrigerator, the type that, it's kind of old school. It's the type that actually had ice in it. You know, you had to chip away the ice on the thing to make sure it still worked. And they also installed a swamp cooler. If you ever, you know, been in the valley, it gets hot there, and a lot of folks can't afford air conditioning. So a swamp cooler is an economic way to cool down their house. And our old one, it seemed that would simply just, the moment you put the water in it, it evaporated immediately. It was just blowing hot air. So this was something that was a sort of a very cool thing to have. And then they weatherized, you know, our home. They, you know, do some weather stripping on you know, our doors and our windows. But even at a young age, I understood one thing. I understood the economic benefit of what was going on here. That's one thing I understood of these upgrades. I knew my mother would always scold us, like many mothers do throughout this nation and world, probably, about leaving the light on when no one is in the room, or, you know, leaving the television on. And I understood that these new appliances and upgrades would help us save money, and our infamous light bill would now be a little less, you know, very basic. And like many folks in my community, the broader environmental benefits associated with those upgrades, you know, the energy efficiency, the late insulation, those were like a third tier of importance for us. You know, first came money, second came comfort, and, you know, third, if people caught it, was the environment at that time. You know, I like to say that, however, through this experience, community members learn some basic thing, that the less energy we use, the less we need to produce energy. And in my community at that particular time, we knew what it meant to produce electricity. And so we were quite familiar with the production of electricity because we understood the real cost of generating electricity. We were experiencing them. You know, I was sharing with some folks right before I got here that at one point when I was around this age, we had the largest tire pile in the world. I could see it from my backyard, burning tires, 40 million tires, the largest tire pile in the world. In an area that already had bad air, we were burning it for electricity. Not too far down the road, one of 3 trash incinerators that are present in the state of California was burning our trash, creating electricity. And, you know, there were, you know, so I say all this because, you know, I mean, and there were other improvements. So we understood, you know, the sort of importance of, you know, electricity and the sort of costs of it. We also had benefits of, you know, low-cost aerator, the aerator faucets that saved water. And in my community, again, as this tool sort of reveals now that I find myself at CalEPA, that we've never been able to drink our water. 1 in 2 million people in the state of California don't have clean and safe drinking water. Never been able to drink the water out of our tap. We understood the preciousness of water and saving water, why that was important to have a low faucet aerator. And I think about that, and that was over 30 years ago. I'm pretty old now, but if you survey my community today, folks can still tell you how much those investments meant to them. They could tell you those investments, how much those investments saved them, and how much their collective efforts were making a change for a cleaner environment. Some of them got that. And I mentioned this story not to preach to all of you about weatherization and how that can help climate change. You guys know that, of course. But I say this because there's a power in a story. There's a power in how we tell our story. And when we create powerful stories, we can get folks to do things that they didn't think they could do. And so when I think about my community on that day, the story wasn't about, the story wasn't getting a swamp cooler and save the earth. That wasn't the story. It was get a swamp cooler to live more comfortably and save a little cash, an economic benefit. But to many people, and some people, it was more. It was more for some residents. It allowed them to do something that they didn't think they could do. And in my mind, as I think about this event, I think of some of my neighbors who didn't say this, but as I think about the learning curve that happened for them, I picture them saying, so you're saying that my weather stripping and my swamp cooler is lessening the demand for us burning those tires, connectivity to the effects. And I say, yes, absolutely. That's how we want to start. And only a powerful story can connect those two things. And I think we need a new story for climate change. One that speaks more directly to all Californians, but specifically our most disadvantaged communities. And look, we know that climate change will have especially a negative impact, on poor communities and communities of color. Probably VN and other people have covered that today. We know that. We know the effects of global warming, such as heat waves and increased air pollution, will have greater effects on disadvantaged communities. We know that. These communities, of course, may not have the resources to adapt, and you guys are all well aware of that. Now, you would think that, saying all that, you would think that the immediate concerns of these disadvantaged communities, the people who live in these disadvantaged communities, you would think that these that their immediate concerns would be ones of basic elements of life: food, shelter, work, those things that would make the disadvantaged less inclined. But I'm saying would make the disadvantaged less inclined to worry about environmental issues. Basically, that because they have to worry about all these basic elements of life, they can't really be bothered with environmental issues. But however, we know this, and for those of you who follow the PPIC and their statewide surveys, we found the opposite to be true. We know people of color and low-income residents are overwhelmingly concerned about global warming and among the most ardent supporters of policies to mitigate greenhouse gases. And these concerns were were sort of further amplified the support for policy intervention, especially among Blacks and Latinos at 88 and 83%. Blacks and Latinos overwhelmingly support action now. But, as I shared with my colleagues earlier today, I think these numbers are a little bit fuzzy, right? Because I just do. I think they're a little bit fuzzy because, that 88% of Latinos agree that something should be done. That's a little different than, expecting something to be done. Last week, and this is my last story, but last week I went back home to celebrate my father's birthday, and that swamp cooler that I described is still there, and it's still working. And at this gathering, we had a few neighbors and family members, folks who normally represent, in my view, disadvantaged communities, poor folks with not a college degree, folks may have some linguistic isolation, meaning they can't speak English, folks who may not have a job, and I said, well, I'm going to speak to Bioneers next week. I kind of want to talk about this. I'm just going to, start a conversation about this. And so I started asking folks, what does the term carbon mean to you? What does the term global warming, climate change, reduction in greenhouse gases mean to you? And, the responses, the answers that I got were predictable, I think, but they were troubling to me. Because most folks didn't understand, of course, the term carbon. When I met Tom, he asked me that specific question. He goes, do people in disadvantaged communities understand the term carbon? And I said, no. They don't understand greenhouse gases either. And if I received an answer about climate change or global warming, it would be something close to the typical melting ice caps and sea level rise. And to most people, they didn't feel like they could participate in those issues that I mentioned of ice caps and sea level rise. And what was obvious to me is they were not making any personal connection to these issues, even the ones that they identified. They did not make any. So for people living in disadvantaged communities, we are missing opportunities to show how climate change is affecting poor folks and people of color right now. And we are simply failing to identify a present and a direct impact to their everyday life. So what I needed that day was a powerful story. I needed a powerful story, a story that would not only link climate change to everyday life, but also a story that has the ability to move folks beyond the I agree with policy interventions to we expect policy interventions, shifting this sort of idle block of our state from 88% agreeing, shifting them to expectation. Those are very different. So in my judgment, we need a story, and we better get one quick. I've spoken to some of you about this, and in my view, what we need is a powerful story. I tend to gravitate towards a health lens. Many of my colleagues focus on both health and economic, but I seem to see the most promise in a public health lens. And I understand that this is not a new concept. I understand a lot of people have been working on this, and even in the state, we have an Office of Health Equity now that is looking at this. But when I travel throughout the state, before I can even start to talk about any environmental pollution, anything, the first thing families or residents want to jump right to the issue of a public health concern, mainly asthma, really. Mainly, by far and away, asthma. And it makes sense. It's present. It could affect their kids, whether or not they're going to school today. It could affect, how they're sleeping at night. It could mean a lot of things. It directs them. It's directly related to them in their everyday life. Now, are these folks thinking about carbon or climate change when they talk to me about this? Probably not. Some actually are almost there. They see a smokestack or they see, polluting cars or trucks, and they say, look, that's our problem. They're almost there. But in many disadvantaged communities throughout the state, there are, I should say this way. In many disadvantaged communities throughout the state, and this is one example, there are existing networks of health educators. In Spanish, we call them promotoras. These are people who have already been trained to explain very complex issues to the people who live in these communities. There's already a network. There's already an infrastructure for this sort of education and information. They can help explain the relationship between public health and climate change. And within these networks, we have transformative opportunities to create and share a powerful story. So I'm kind of setting up that session because I want to say that I want to leave you with this. In this document that I saw for this session, I saw the quote from Senator De Leon about, this sort of thing that we need to teach the electric car to speak Spanish, right? And I see a lot of, he may or may not have seen multiple sort of interpretations of that, but I see that as, of course, I think the surface sort of idea behind that is that we want all segments of our society to sort of take part in any advancements that we make as a result of climate change, whether it's zero-emission cars. We want all segments of our society to prosper and experience the benefits of this because they sure as hell has been experiencing the burdens. Yeah. But I think there's something else there too. I think, it's not enough, with of course, what he's saying is you're trying to get zero emissions into, low income or communities of color, and that's fine. But that only gets us halfway. It only gets us to maybe now they feel like they're reducing pollution in their community. But we're not connecting that to the bigger and broader issues of climate, of which we need those folks to engage in. So I'll say this, is that, at CalEPA, we have been working on disadvantaged communities. It's part of our work. It's Senate Bill 535 as a result of Senator De Leon. It takes 25% of the funds from the cap and trade revenues and it redirects them to disadvantaged communities, but we're not stopping there. We use the tool for other things too, like enforcement, to make sure laws are being followed. And thanks to Jose Carmona and Assembly Member Victor Manuel Perez, we now have laws that use that tool not only for funds but for enforcement. We use it to put in solar panels. We're using it to put in active transportation in some communities. We're carving out a piece of the pie so those folks that are in these disadvantaged communities don't get left behind. But I think we need a powerful story to connect those folks with our broader goals with respect to climate. So thank you.
Any questions for Arsenio?
Questions? There's no questions. This is the first. Yes.
My name is Carla Maze. I've been working in civic innovation for quite some time on trying to make that connection, using economic development. One of the things is we're bringing, you've eloquently put on how much of this, that we've got this 25% cap and trade money that's coming to the community, but how much of that investment is actually being that there's frameworks and implementation strategies for sustainable business and local living economies in these communities which have been ill affected, because they are now like Oakland and other places are very much the gentrification spots, right?
Sure.
We open up these opportunities in local living economies and sustainability, but for the residents that have been, begging for this kind of investment, now they're getting pushed out. So what are some of the things that you at the EPA or others have been working on to make sure that that investment goes to those folks who have been waiting for it for so long?
There's a lot of work. That's a good question. There's so much work to do in that arena. Many of the folks here, as I see in this room, they're working on that to help us. I mean, you have to understand that, with this first round of money, we're kind of making this up as we go along. Nobody would probably say that, but everybody knows it.
How do we join?
Right. No, you join us. There's coalitions. There's a 535 coalition made up of VN and the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and CBE and public advocates. These folks are at the table, and in my view, I've never seen government work with it, maybe because I've only been on the other side. I've never seen where government is actually truly, meaningfully engaging our advocate organizations. But they have a seat at the table just like anybody else, and I think from the results you'll see that that seat is taking into consideration the thoughts and ideas that come from that are being heavily implemented. I would hope that's how all administrations operate, but for me, on the outside, I never saw that with government, and so I think this is maybe something new. But I would say hook up with them. Those are the issues that they are tackling to assure, and they're working directly with us to make sure that we put in those safeguards. But it's so challenging. It's so challenging. We have less than $1 billion. We have $832 million to spend this year. We're already planning to spend next year's money, of which I don't have a total on yet. But it's a challenge, and to be honest, it's sort of discomforting in the sense that, the first recipients of this money will largely be established entities, and these big entities, big transportation entities, big cities, whether or not, I guess the time will tell whether or not these funds actually do trickle down more directly to communities. I think it has to. I think the legislature as well as the people will not stand for anything less, but I think that it's going to be a challenge. And I can say, in this first year, it's going to be, light. We're going to plant some trees, put in some solar, do some weatherization. That's the stuff that people may see, touch, and feel as my story, my experience. Those are the things that people may feel. Outside of that, it may be very difficult to connect them to other things, and I won't mention those other things, but it's it's going to be a challenge. Yes.
Yeah, I live in New Mexico, and some friends of ours, a group called the New Energy Economy, did a survey around the kinds of story that you're asking. And the Anglo community, the driving force was essentially economic development. And the Hispanic and Native community, it was future generations. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I just got back from a tribal conference and I spoke to all the tribes in this region, New Mexico and Arizona and California. It's, you know, you can't take, it's getting back to this idea of the story, and you can't assume that the same story is going to work for everybody. There's different cultural norms, and you guys all get that. I mean, I'm not, you know, everybody understands that, but I think sometimes, you know, our actions, you know, don't really weigh that as much as we could. Of course, there are different values systems or cultural beliefs with respect to how you treat your natural resources. But you know, it's something that we're really tinkering with right now with respect to traditional ecological knowledge from the tribes. You know, taking that traditional sort of input and how they have sustainably done a lot of things for a very long time, of which we've managed to screw up. But bringing those sort of practices back into our cookie cutter governmental sort of processes. It's difficult, but I gave a few examples. I talk to you later. We have made some inroads on that.
Yeah, question. This is a great subject, by the way, in terms of the stories that are available. There's an amazing story about soil and how rebuilding soil can solve huge climate things as well as water issues. And with new things like AB 551, looking at how, and a bunch of these grants that are going for water, looking how local communities can look at agriculture, especially these communities that you're talking about that have a broad background in agriculture, about how they can implement that in the cities, hyper-local with AB 551, getting these spaces for way less money and working with the cities. So the story of rebuilding soil and the water saving, the carbon sequestration, we're working on making the story, and we love to work with you, but these communities, for especially the inner cities with garden building and regenerative agriculture, to rebuild the soils could be a really great one.
Yeah, no, and broadly, you know, and that's a good point. And that was just with soil. I just got speaking to a lot of vegetation folks, also trying to map out finally a map of vegetation and talking about the potential of carbon sequestration with preserving certain vegetations and hotspots in vegetation. No, yeah, I'd love to help with that. I think that we're getting the hook here. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Arsenio, so much.
Thank you.